Okay, we're going to be alive in a few seconds. Hello, everyone. So my name is Asja Novak, and I would like to welcome you to the fourth day of the 22nd Red Dawn's Feminist and Queer Festival. This year, the festival is held between the 5th and the 11th of March, and due to obvious reasons, online. The festival, which gathers its strengths around the 8th of March, or as we all call it, our holiday, is a space for us to work, to create, to care for our community, and especially cultivate resistance. If you have not yet had the pleasure to attend one of our events, I invite you to check it out and check our full program through www.rdečezore.org. So this event will be live streamed through our Rdeče Zore Red Dawn's Facebook page. So for who wishes not to be visible during the stream, we recommend you to turn off your cameras. But if you're okay with that, we would prefer you to have your cameras on. So after the lecture, there will be also we will have a short Q&A with the author. So do not hesitate to put your questions in the Zoom chat or under the Facebook stream. Of course, it is preferable if you ask your questions directly after the lecture, but we will read out all the questions posted in the chats. So for the intents of a better quality of the stream, your microphones should be muted during the lecture. And of course, unmuted when you are trying to ask a question. So with no further ado, I would like to introduce today's lecturer, Asja Novak. Asja Novak works with writing, translating, and activism. They hold an MA in Critical Studies from Sandberg Institute, Amsterdam, and an MSSC in Gender Studies from Lidköping University. Their research interests broadly revolve around feminist, decolonial, and queer theory and epistemologies. Their most recent work looks at Western representations of Balkan gender variance. They are currently based in Ljubljana, where they are partaking in an ASC long-term volunteering project with the Ljubljana Pride Association. Well, that's quite a resume, Asja. So first of all, thank you everyone that's shown up today for this lecture, but also thank you, Asja, for being able to join us today. And it's so lovely to have you. So if you would like to, we're okay with you just starting your lecture. We're all very excited about the topic.
Thanks, Sasha. Thanks for introducing me, and thanks so much for having me here and putting together this festival and making sure that everyone feels safe and comfortable. Also, thank you everyone for joining and for agreeing to listen to me talk for an hour. It's a bit daunting. If you see me breathing heavily and like holding my hand on my chest, that's because I'm trying to keep it together. I would also like to thank the queer and trans activists in Ljubljana, some of whom who are here, in conversations with whom I kind of developed some of the thoughts that I'm sharing in this paper. So before I start, I want to make some disclaimers and like introduce the context a bit so as to manage expectations. I wrote this text in the context of a gender studies department in Sweden with an international, mostly Scandinavian and Western European audience in mind, which means that there might be some parts that are not new to the Slovenian listeners and I would just like to thank you in advance for your patience in hearing through things that you already know. Hopefully there won't be so much of it. Then I would like to just say that I don't consider myself an expert on Albanian sworn virgins by any means. I'm not an anthropologist or an ethnographer. I haven't spoken to any Albanian sworn virgins. I haven't done interviews. And that was a conscious choice because I didn't want to, because of obvious like physical and time constraints and etc. But also because I didn't want to reproduce this dynamic of a Western researcher coming to prod and ask all of these like private questions to these people, especially because in many interviews it's clear that the Albanian sworn virgins themselves were not so keen on being interviewed by journalists and Western researchers and etc. I also consciously didn't include any slides and pictures. Slides because I don't like it. This is my dog. I'm sorry. He's a puppy and he's a bit crazy. 1 second. I'm sorry. He'll calm down and shut up eventually, I think. I hope.
No worries. We like this. So
It's very loud. So I consciously didn't include pictures because often I've seen articles that mostly consist of pictures. They're mostly like a gallery. Okay, 1 second.
I think he desperately needs your attention.
yeah, this is the reality we live in now, and we're no worries. Everyone is being patient, and you know we have the same problems.
Thanks. Yeah, he's been quiet like the whole day. So now it's his time to shine.
Of course. Well, I think that somebody knows that we're live. Please continue.
Yes, thank you. So yes, I didn't include pictures because I've seen a lot of kind of like these galleries websites, right, where you can only see pictures of Albanian sworn virgins, but there's no text, there's no context. It's just like kind of this like, look at these people, look, this is something weird, let's you know. So I didn't want to partake in that either. All of this being said, the reason why I was really happy to be able to talk about this topic specifically at this event, in this context, is because I've noticed that people in Slovenia, that some of the people in Slovenia that I've talked to, and in Croatia, don't really know about this topic, and this took me by surprise. Some of them have heard of it maybe like a little bit, but not in any detail. And I think this is a great place, first of all, to kind of introduce the topic more and start conversations about it. But I would also like to, like, after I'm done sharing my work, I would like to open up the space to kind of hear what your previous engagement with the topic has been, like whether you've heard about it, whether not, why you think it's not talked about, and just, yeah, start a conversation about it. So just to like briefly walk you through what's about to happen. First, I'm gonna tell you shortly how I got thinking about this topic, how it connects or doesn't connect to me personally. Then I will introduce, sorry, I'm seeing some chat stuff. Okay, never mind. Then I'm gonna introduce Albanian sworn virgins, who they are, what they're about, briefly. Then I'm gonna try to, as quickly as possible, rush through my theoretical background, which is gonna consist of talking about the concept of coloniality of gender, about Balkanism, which I'm gonna spend a bit more time on, homonationalism, which I'm gonna spend a bit more time on, and if there's time, which there probably won't be, intersectionality, I might just skip past that. Then I will present my analysis, which is mostly me looking at, so I looked at 10 different English language journalistic texts about Albanian sworn virgins. And my analysis is basically me raging about how transphobic and yeah, like how it reproduces transphobic and Balkanist discourse. And after that, I would like to just share some of my first impressions and questions about the Slovenian kind of activist scene's engagement with the topic. Okay. Yes, now that I've done all the introduction stuff, I will start with the content. So I first came to learn about the existence of, oh, another disclaimer. Throughout the text, I refer to Albanian sworn virgins as tojbeli. Tojbeli is one of the local languages term that is used. And I chose to use that one instead of virdžine or nanaša, which is more common, because, and this was kind of like my personal choice, because both virdžine and nanaša is gendered as feminine within the local languages. And because these people are misgendered so much in the text that I talk about, I didn't want to use things that sound feminine to refer to them. So I called them tojbeli. So I first came to learn about the existence of tojbeli in the library of the Women's Studies Center in Zagreb in 2017, when I was doing research on the history of the feminist movement in my home country. So for context, I'm from Croatia. So flipping through the pages of an old issue of the Women Through History magazine, I came across an article about women from northern Albania who take a vow of celibacy and consequently live their life as men. At the time, I was working on a piece of writing which attempted to capture some of the intricacies of the relationships between women within my own family, me included, and how our shared or unshared feminist or unfeminist histories had shaped those. So although at the time I did still consider myself largely a woman, I had started reflecting on my gender identity around that time. And within a few months, I started coming out as non-binary to a select group of people. Fun fact, I have never told my mom about this, and she might be watching this live stream. So that's fun. Bok mama. So there were other things going on at the time as well. The 10th year of my absence from Croatia was approaching, and I had started reflecting on how the fact that I had spent my formative years in Western European countries studying in westernized educational institutions had shaped and influenced the gaze that I was casting back at my culture of origin. I was also considering moving back, but I was terrified of giving up the privileges that I had living as a white queer person in the Netherlands. And also whenever I would talk to Croatian queer friends about it, they were like, why? Don't do it. So all of these things came into play as I started thinking about this new instance of gender variance that I had just discovered, and that had existed right at my doorstep, or at least much closer to home than my previous research had taken me. So Albanian sworn virgins, as the English texts referred to them, were essentially trans men. I had decided, putting the newfound information into the pre-existing categories that I had learned in my westernized European academia and activism. And I tried to draw parallels between the lives and experiences of tojbeli, which I knew very little about, and what I, in my mind, very problematically referred to as contemporary trans folk from the region, which I also actually knew very little about. I was surprised that those parallels hadn't been, to my knowledge, previously drawn by trans activists and historians from the region. because I found it profoundly inspiring to think that something about my transness wasn't a foreign import into my culture or some kind of catching up with narratives of Western progress, but something that had in fact existed in our collective consciousness for centuries or more. So in a sense, finding out about this gave my transness a sense of legitimacy, a first-hand statement of we belong here, we have always been here. But I did at the same time realize that so much of my thinking about tojbeli and so much of the authors that I was reading about them had been influenced by exactly those same narratives of progress and Western European superiority and universality, like down to the language that I was using. So I had to like think about all of these things, and that's how I came to formulate my questions and like think about my theoretical background. I don't know if you hear him. He's making really weird noise in the background. So I came to formulate my research question, which was two-part. The first part was, in what ways are contemporary journalistic representations of tojbeli in the English language informed by transphobic, colonial, and Balkanist discourses? And the second part was kind of asking questions about in what way, whether and in what way these same discourses are reflected in queer activism within the region itself. And this was an attempt to like answer the question of like, why do we not talk, like why do I find out about this so late, so specifically, etc. Wait. I need to sit like a bisexual, I'm sorry. So tojbeli, tojbelie, virdžer, virdžine are some of the many Albanian, Serbian, Croatian, and local languages words to refer to the instance of gender variance endemic to southwestern Balkans that in English are referred to as Albanian sworn virgins. So in terms of present day nation states, that's mostly Albania, Kosovo, Montenegro, a little bit of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and some parts of southern Croatia. So this practice whereby a person assigned female at birth transitions into a masculine social role either as a child or later in life is said to have originated in the early 15th century and continues into the present day. English language literature on the topic is limited and can mostly be divided into two categories: anthropological and ethnological research and popular journalism. Within the category of anthropological and ethnological research, they frequently kind of refer back to 18th and 19th century travelogues written by Western European travelers through the Balkans. And the popular journalism category consists of more contemporary, kind of like 2010 onwards accounts. I haven't found any English language research published on the topic from like a specifically gender or trans perspective. And I haven't seen the parallels drawn between these different discourses that come into it and like local activisms. So the most extensive English language study on the phenomenon, on what they call it the phenomenon of tojbeli, published thus far, is the British anthropologist and ethnographer Antonia Young's 2000 book called Women Who Become Men. You know, we already see all the misgendering. It is clear from the structure and the focus of this study that Young's intended audience has little or no prior knowledge of kind of the context in which tojbeli live, and Young reserves more space in her book for the introduction of these like crazy differences than to the actual interviews with tojbeli. Nevertheless, she makes a distinction between 3 different types of tojbeli based on the time and kind of reason for their transition. So according to her, there are tojbeli whose choice was made in childhood or even before birth by their parents. This choice is usually triggered by the absence of a male child in the family who would be able to inherit the property and be the head of the household after the father's death. There's also those whose choice came after puberty, usually as a way of evading an unwanted arranged marriage without instigating blood feud. Or there's a third variation, which Young claims that doesn't exist anymore, which is a semi-religious one. So she doesn't, however, mention that some tojbeli choose to transition because of their own sense of gender identity, which is hinted at in the words of many of the tojbeli interviewed in the other accounts. So that's kind of the intro on what's being written about them. So onto the theoretical background. First, I'll talk about coloniality of gender. So I start from the, assumption, statement, whatever, that binary gender and sex division and the consequent distribution of social power or powerlessness on the basis of this division is neither scientifically accurate nor historically and geographically universal. There are plenty of sources documenting a variety of different instances of gender variance across time and space, some of which are more well-known than others, which is also a bit weird, everyone's heard of two spirits, but we haven't heard of these people that live like literally over there. Anyway, so that this fact is rising in importance to the contemporary study of transgender identities is exemplified by the fact that Christina Richards, Walter Bauman, and Meg John Barker start their comprehensive 2017 account of genderqueer and non-binary genders in the book of the same title, with a chapter on gender diversity across the globe. And they include gender variance endemic to some European cultures, including the Albanian sworn virgins. And they do this in order to challenge the mainstream, in brackets, racist belief that such gender transgressions are a thing of the pre-modern, pre-colonial past in terms of both a physical and a temporal distance from the contemporary European center. So the Indian-American non-binary artist and activist Alok Vaid Menon puts in very plain terms, transmisogyny is the afterlife of colonialism. They go on to explain that, quote, certainly there were formations of gender norms and heterosexuality prior to colonization, but what colonialism did was officially establish the gender binary and heteronormativity. What colonialism did was criminalize people from transgressing from these gender and sexual norms. End quote. In another later interview, they summarized the impact of this history concisely by stating that, quote, the imposition of the gender and sex binary is an act of racism, end quote. And this is from an interview from 2018. So with this, Alok already sets the stage for an understanding of the intimate connections between discourse on trans lives and narratives and anti-colonial and anti-racist work, which it seems has not been elaborated on in detail in the context of the Balkans, despite the bonds of solidarity that could be built between the subjects who are affected by both racialized and gendered systems of oppression and their intersections. So this is also something that Maria Lugones, a South American theorist who passed, I think, this summer, she tackles this with her concept, the coloniality of gender, that she first introduced in her famous 2008 text of the same title. So in this text, Lugones I'm not going to get into details, but basically she sets out to show how biological dimorphism and the patriarchal and heterosexual organization of relations, which she understands as features of the modern / colonial gender system, are, quote, crucial to an understanding of the differential gender arrangements among racial lines, end quote. And also I have to blow my nose. Sorry. So also I looked at Oyeronke Oyewumi, a Yoruba writer who in her classic 1997 book, The Invention of Women, making an African sense of Western gender discourses, she kind of critiques other like male theorists of colonization for not focusing their analysis on how colonialism and racialization impact women and gender variant subjects differently from how they impact men, and in turn how differently racialized subjects are also gendered and sexed differently. So in her later work, What Gender is Motherhood, Oyewumi also elaborates on the way in which the Western European conceptualization of binary gender and social hierarchization based on that gender division is not, it was not an inherent characteristic of her Yoruba culture pre-colonization, but that such a conceptualization was in fact a historically specific European invention imported into colonized spaces as a tool of control. So, how is all of this connected to tojbeli, who, as I mentioned before, exist within the geographical borders of Europe and are not a strictly speaking colonized non-European space? Can one talk about coloniality of gender and intersections of race and gender in the context of subjects who are racialized in very different ways from where these texts originated from? How European are the Balkans exactly? So this is where Balkanism and nesting Orientalisms come in. I'm sorry about all this theory. So Balkanism is a term that was first introduced by Maria Todorova in her classic 1997 book, Imagining the Balkans. And she starts the book with the statement that one does not need special proof that the Balkans have been described as the other of Europe. She largely builds on the work on Orientalism by Edward Said, whereof she says, quote, "My aim is to position myself vis-a-vis the Orientalist discourse and elaborate on a seemingly identical, but actually only similar phenomenon, which I call Balkanism." So there's kind of a debate between Todorova and the other like main theorist of Balkanism, Milica Bakić-Hajdn, about how similar Balkanism is to Orientalism or not. But I think we can leave that aside and just kind of like take what is useful from the concept. So interestingly, Todorova, following Larry Wolff's argument from Inventing Eastern Europe, she explains that while the East-West dichotomy has historically juxtaposed societies that were opposed for political, religious, and cultural reasons, the East was not always the pejorative component of this opposition. But she explains that it was only with the economic takeoff of Western Europe in the modern period that the East became, quote, internalized as the less privileged of the opposition pair. So the division began gradually to acquire different overtones, borrowed and adapted from the belief in evolution and progress flourishing during the Enlightenment in the late 18th century, end quote, which points to the direct connection between the establishment of the East as other and the height of colonial activity of the Western European imperialist project. An important dimension of this discourse that is relevant for what we're talking about here is that of time, where, as Todorova points out, and I'm quoting, the movement from past to future is not merely motion, but it's evolution from simple to complex, backwards to developed, and primitive to cultivated. So in this developmentalist understanding of Eurocentered, linear progress of time, the Balkans have served to form a discursive and metaphorical bridge between the civilized and in contemporary discourse progressive Europe and the backward, primitive, uncivilized, colonized East. In their book from 2017 called Rodi Balkan, Porodnjavanje Balkanizma, Gender and the Balkans, Gendering Balkanism, Mateja Matešić and Svetlana Slapšak summarize this issue in the following terms, and I quote my shoddy translation of the Croatian. The concept of Eastern Europe, according to Wolff, later gave way for the universal concept of developmentalism, because Europe found in Eastern Europe a kind of half-blood, a hybrid, which served as proof that if this dedicated mongrel can successfully embrace and follow Europe as its role model, then the rest of the world can also successfully follow it towards socio-political development. Within the framework of the European theory of development of human civilization, into the center of which Europe placed itself, it needed a link, a bridge, to cross over the gap Europe imagined between itself and the East, and with the help of which it could visualize the different stages of the development of civility. So Europe basically needed the Balkans to be an in-between stage between the civilized and the savage. This narrative, I argue here, is present on many levels in the contemporary discourse on LGBTQI+ rights within Europe, as well as being visible in the treatment of tojbeli in Western journalistic sources that I look at. So I mentioned before the other important theorist of Balkanism, Milica Bakić-Hayden, who defines also the concept of nesting Orientalisms, which she describes as the gradation of Orients, a pattern of reproduction of the original dichotomy upon which Orientalism is premised, whereby Asia is more East and other than Eastern Europe. Within Eastern Europe itself, this gradation is reproduced with the Balkans perceived as most Eastern, and within the Balkans, there are similarly constructed hierarchies. So basically what this means is that, like, in this discourse, the more east you go, the more primitive it gets. And I think this is, this is something that is quite visible just in the way that we talk about people within the Balkans. I think we're kind of aware of the attitudes that exist, like within Slovenia about the rest of former Yugoslavia, that exist within Croatia about the other people more east. And so, like, the more east you go, the more derogatory the attitudes can get. I'm not used to talking this much. So this is manifested very clearly I think, in the contemporary political and social discourse within the Balkan nation states. Thank you, Tina. Where there is clear evidence of power differentials along ethno-nationalist and religious lines as based on proximity to Western Europeanness. So Bakić Hajdn talked about this by explaining that within the context of former Yugoslavia, geographical proximity to Western Europe was perceived as preferable to locations further away and under spheres of influence other than Western European. So she talks about how Slovenia and Croatia, referred to as the Northern Republics, who through the Habsburg rule and Catholicism had the most proximity to Western Europe, as opposed to the areas that were under the influence of Ottoman rule, Orthodox religion, Islam. They were endowed within this symbolic geography with positive traits, in contrast with the negative traits which got attached to the more southern and eastern parts of the region. And this proximity this proximity, she explains, means that the, quote, historical circumstances which led to the industrial development in Western Europe have been appropriated by Slovenes and Croats as the product of their superior qualities and qualified them to join Europe at the present time in this developmentalist understanding of narratives of contemporaneity. Yes, I got it. Another aspect of Balkanism that I think is relevant to what we're talking about here is that unlike the standard Orientalist discourse, which kind of uses metaphors of the female and the feminine, the Balkanist discourse is singularly male. The Balkans are thus seen as this place where women rarely appear, and if they do, they're either presented as constrained to their homes with absence of voice or agency, or they appear equally as mannish and belligerent as the rest of the imagined region. And this is from Matešić and Slabšak. And I think maybe here it's good to say that like this discourse kind of like, really comes about in these travel logs from the 18th and the 19th century that I talked about before, that many of the texts on Albanian sworn virgins refer back to. So in fact, Matešić and Slabšak show at length in their book that Western European discourse has historically constructed Balkan womanhood in very different ways from white European womanhood. So they give examples of Western travel writing on the Morlac women, which I think in Croatian we call Vlasi. It's a nomad ethnic group endemic to the Adriatic hinterland. So their representations in these texts are based on an exoticizing fascination and the scientific measuring of their breasts, which is, quite kind of like reminiscent of how other racialized women have been presented and approached and etc. And so it's either breasts or it's a contemplation of their distinct lack of beauty. So on this, Matešić and Slabšak write, and I'm quoting, "Women's breasts become the site of scientific and technical inscription of cultural, ethnic, and even racial differences as seen by the Europeans. And the hierarchy of values attached to these differences gain specific attention when placed within a gendered discourse on female beauty and normative femininity." So if one looks at some of these representations, which I won't reproduce here because they're not pretty, I think the racializing quality of these descriptions of the Balkan peoples becomes obvious. And I think maybe many of the aspects of racialization that are reminiscent of that still prevail within Western Europe. And now they're often intertwined with contemporary like anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim sentiments and policies. That's it on Balkanism. Now for the part that might be boring to Slovenians. I want to give like a super brief little thing about Slovenian queer history, and then I'll go on to talk about homonationalism and Europeanization of LGBTQIA+ activism in the region. Is this the biggest mug you've ever seen or what?
I'm jealous. Looks awesome.
So the earliest mention of male homosexuality in the legal context in Slovenia dates back to 1749, when, oh God, I don't know how to pronounce these names in Slovenian, Peter Vomber and Anton Grabovec probably, were sued for homosexual activity and subsequently killed, although homosexual activity was not officially marked as illegal until 1959. And this only lasted until 1977, when homosexuality was decriminalized throughout Yugoslavia. So not to minimalize it, but Franco Dota talks about how on the records, there were only 520 people who were prosecuted in Yugoslavia during the years of criminalization of homosexuality, which is a number which remains really negligible in comparison with the thousands and tens of and hundreds of thousands that were prosecuted in the same period in Western and more modern countries. This, combined with the fact that Ljubljana was the site of the first European LGBT film festival in 1984, which continues on to the present day, it paints a picture of the situation of queer folk in Yugoslavia that is quite different from what like a Swedish or a Dutch reader or listener might intuitively expect from the Balkan context. And especially considering that some of the local population as well seems to hold a belief that, LGBT rights are something that came together with the transition from socialist to capitalist state in this unidirectional track of progressive history. So yeah, just to kind of, I don't know, I just wanted to show the Swedes that we're not the way that they think that we are. The discourse on LGBTQI lives and rights in the context of post-Yugoslavian nation states, including Slovenia, seems to be significantly intertwined with the movement toward Europeanization and neoliberalization of those states, where progressive LGBTQIA+ legislation is often pushed as part of the European Union accession process within the candidate states, often without much kind of like regard or acknowledgement of the needs and grievances of the local queer communities. So I'm not saying this is a bad thing, but I'm saying that it's not really done for the queer people in the context, in the local context. And like often, the community then faces backlash afterwards, from which the politicians can just be like, oh, sorry, but the EU wanted this. I don't stand behind this, but we had to do it for the EU. So on this, I will quote from the opening chapter of LGBT activism and Europeanization in the post-Yugoslav space by Bojan Bilic. So Bilic opens his volume by reminding the reader that Western European prosperity, to which the candidate states of the Balkan region aspire to gain access to, is, quote, deeply rooted in the history of global imperial pursuits and long-term exploitation fed by racism. He continues quoting another two authors from a text titled "What is the EU?" Quote, "The states that constituted the EU at the beginning of the 21st century are the same states that had exercised imperial rule over nearly half of the inhabitable surface of the globe outside Europe just 2 or 3 generations ago. Their colonial possessions amounted to nearly 3/4 of all the foreign territory holdings in the world." End quote. And they also add that, again, quote, "Practically all current borderlines in Central and Eastern Europe have been drafted by West European imperial powers as part of the dissolution and reorganization of various local empires." So building on from this, Bilic goes on to say that, like, the whole premise of his book is that, quote, "European Union sexual politics is unlikely to be untouched by the colonial legacy of the major European powers. Power differentials embedded in centuries of colonial rule equalize Western Europe / Anglo-Saxon West with the whole continent and produce axes of distinction and division that, while glossing over a plethora of political systems and social experiences, render Eastern Europe as constantly and consistently trailing behind the more progressive Western part of Europe." So within these processes, the politics of LGBTQI rights are utilized to maintain the colonial power positions, whereby Europe is equated with progress, while intolerance to queer rights is presented as a sign of the non-European backwardness. You know, despite the fact that heteropatriarchy was oftentimes exactly a European import into those non-European contexts. So this is what Jasbir K. Poir talks about when he talks about homonationalism. He refers to these processes through which tolerance to sexual and, by extension, gender minorities is used within European politics to justify racism, xenophobia, Islamophobia. Sorry, I'm just thinking, do I read this whole quote or not? It's basically rights of sexual minorities are used within Europe as markers of progress and a way to, like, keep out the homophobic immigrant other. And we've seen this, like, time and time and again. We really, it's kind of like the tolerance to sexual minorities becomes what, like, in the old colonial times was like the women question. So it's like white Europeans protecting. It's like a few years ago when there were sexual assault cases in Germany, and they were committed by refugees, and then Germans were like, "We need to protect our women," and I was like, "Not your women. Where have you been protecting them so far?" Anyway, that applied to sexual minorities. So these types of discourses serve to perpetuate what Bilic calls as forms of self-Balkanization. That is the internalization of these ideas of foreign cultural supremacy and the absorption of the basic values and categories of colonial Europe, as well as an uncritical kind of emulation of Western models of social organizing. So what I'm thinking is that these processes have indeed trickled in and affected the way in which trans and queer activism in Slovenia functions. And this is what I want to like talk about when I'm done with all this. Okay, so that was the theory. And now I want to tell you about how tojbeli are talked about. But first, maybe I want to see how people are doing. Are people still alive? Okay, cool.
I think that we are, yes.
All right, nice. Thank you. I'm gonna just drink some more.
Yeah, maybe, you know, like if you see that we're nodding, then you can just show us the puppy. We will be fine.
I think the puppy is asleep again, which I will not disturb. I don't actually know where he is. I hope he's okay. All right. So onto the representations. Let me just find it. Okay, so this part I kind of structured thematically, kind of like tackling one notable motif of or area of concern at the time. So first, I talk about the way that gender terminology and pronouns are used to refer to tojbeli in the 10 texts that I analyzed. So looking at the text in question, it quickly becomes apparent that they overwhelmingly refer to tojbeli as women, using expressions such as women living as men, women who choose to, in brackets, or must live a masculine life, women who decided to become a man, or virtual males, as one of them refers to them. In almost all the cases, the designation of tojbeli as women, despite their frequent partial or complete identification with being a man, occurs already in the title of the article, where they're always like, yeah, this shit basically just happens before you even open the article. In many cases, when they do use masculine terminology to talk about tojbeli, they place the words in inverted commas to indicate the distance from what the authors and the presumable audience of the text would consider true. So examples would be like, they would say like the man on the mule, guy, but then it's all in inverted commas, uncle, honorary man. So they do this to show that while this might be how the actors in the story perceive the tojbeli in question, you and me, like the author and the reader, both know better. So I think that this does two things. Firstly, it serves to reinforce this imagined bond between author and the reader, whereby through the use of inverted commas, the reader is kind of drawn into a form of knowledge that is shared between the author and the reader, but not the objects of the writing. So it basically forms this type of dramatic irony where the author and the reader are both equally the subjects of knowledge in opposition to the unknowing objects of the writing who don't understand that they're actually wrong. So an us versus them dynamic is established, which simultaneously does the work of constructing the English-speaking Euro-American author and reader as the knowing subjects attempting to explain the situation of the unknown and unknowing Balkan other. A similar effect is created by the author's use of pronouns when referring to tojbeli. So only 2 of the analyzed sources attempt to respect the pronouns of one of their interviewees in the face of their explicit and I don't know how to pronounce this word, unequivocal, that's how you pronounce it, statement of their preference. But they still manage to fall short. For example, while referring to Diana, who explained that, quote, I in myself felt like a boy, end quote, since he was a child. The authors of the article switch pronouns in the middle of the paragraph while talking about his childhood. So they say, quote, his mother was from Kosovo, his father an officer in the Albanian army, stationed at Tropoje when Diana was born. The little girl spent the first 9 years of her life in this small town on the border with what is now Kosovo. I get angry at this part. So a similar thing happens when the authors talk about Haki, of whom they say, quote, some Burneshas had such a flexible sense of their gender that you might refer to them as a he or a she, or use the pronouns interchangeably, not Haki, end quote. Still, even here, despite having managed to stick to the stated he throughout the text, the authors of this text still can't resist misgendering Haki in the closing sentence for dramatic effect. And they close the piece with an emphatic quote. And with that, he said, I think we're done. Quietly but emphatically, as if we really were, and led Ermal and me to the gate and the road, making sure we were in our car and well on our way before he turned and went back inside to all the freedom she would have otherwise lost had it not belonged to him. So, and Haki was one of the ones that like super didn't want to speak to them. The reason why he said, I think we're done, is because he didn't want to speak to them to begin with. Anyway, others almost invariably use she, despite often explicitly acknowledging that their interlocutors use different language to refer to themselves. For example, quote, at the mention of choice, which merits special emphasis, she becomes more animated, or perhaps we should say he. Diana uses the masculine to refer to himself, end quote. So this deliberate misgendering, explicit and deliberate misgendering, not only erases tojbeli's gender in an unabashed act of transphobia, but is also tied up with colonial attitudes in the form of the Western authors' privileging of their own perspective on the tojbeli's gender over the tojbeli's own. My earring got stuck on my sweater. In fact, some of the analyzed articles even perpetuate the extremely dangerous narrative of being fooled by the gender variant person the cisgender speaker in the article has encountered. Such instances as the author realizing that, quote, the man on the mule had actually been a woman, end quote, or an anecdote of a puzzled border officer when faced by the fact that, quote, the Albanian passport he is holding belongs to a woman, but the hand that tendered it was that of an old man, end quote. And, they often talk about their own confusion about looking at photographs of tojbeli, being like, it looked like men, but that, whatever. And all of these examples all of these are kind of examples of how this trope of being fooled is used to introduce the mysterious topic of gender violence. Variance, but actually we're coming to violence. So in the introduction to the Transgender Studies reader, Susan Stryker explains how gender variance gets tangled up in moral terms, which often lead to explicit violence against trans people. She explains that in a system where the relationship, quote, the relationship between bodily sex, gender role, and subjective gender identity are imagined to be strictly mechanically mimetic, a real thing and its reflections. Transgender people who problematize the assumed correlation of a particular biological sex with a particular social gender are often considered to make false representations of an underlying material truth through the willful distortion of surface appearance. So Stryker goes on to explain that, quote, their gender presentation is seen as a lie rather than as an expression of a deep essential truth, and they are therefore bad by definition, end quote. So this points to how the trope of fooling the cis people in their surroundings leads to the construction of the bad transsexual, who in turn deserves to be punished for their transgressions. And this, you know, this idea of people lying about their true gender and sex is what causes a lot of violence towards mostly trans women, and also it can still be used to this day, like trans panic, gay panic can be used as the legal defense in case of murders of trans people in court. So this is extremely bad. Furthermore, while the tone and placements of these anecdotes of being fooled within the narrative framework of these texts indicates that the intended reading of them was one of the self-ironizing admittance of the author's own unknowingness of the custom, or maybe even a well-meaning, although still patronizing and transphobic, congratulating on the tojbeli's successful passing. What is being constructed through the being fooled trope is still a difference between the truth of tojbeli's gender and the gender that they live as. So by subsuming tojbeli into this mirror style representation that Stryker describes, tojbeli are also being subsumed into the Western and Eurocentric understandings of binary gender that they themselves clearly do not subscribe to. In fact, many of the tojbeli interviewed or referred to in the articles explicitly talk about their gender identity as not being that of a woman, as is evidenced in statements such as, quote, I guess you could say I was partly a woman and partly a man, end quote, and quote, I myself, I felt like a boy, end quote. So this can be seen as a discursive taking away of tojbeli's agency over their own bodies and genders by the Western researcher journalist who has come to study them. He's eating something. I don't know what he's eating. That's always like really fun when you have a puppy. Whenever you go to the shop, you never know what you're going to find destroyed when you come home. It's always a lottery. So tojbeli are often presented as being strange, almost mythical, and notoriously hard to find. Many of the texts analyzed start their account by painting a mysterious and distant scenery, often using Balkanist language and painting Albania and other regions where tojbeli live as unambiguously backwards. So the authors speak about being lost on one of the dirt tracks in northern Albania's accursed mountains, and you know, remember their time in the cool color palette and the wistful feeling of the Albanian landscape as so much to experience without talking, quiet stretches punctuated by roadside fires, stray dogs, armed men, homegrown potatoes, strong coffee and conversation, a study in contradictions. Tojbeli are mainly described as living in small remote villages deep in the Albanian Alps, in isolated regions of northern Albania, a land of ultra-conservative Moors, in a lost valley to where no straight roads go, like there's any places in the mountains to which there are straight roads, whatever. Despite the fact, right, that the authors of these articles have themselves interviewed Tojbeli who live in the outskirts or in the outskirts of Tirana or in Tirana, the Albanian capital. But that's not as, you know, scenic to describe as the Lost Valleys. So Albania is presented as a desperately poor and macho country that was cut off from mainstream Europe for decades under a Stalinist dictatorship. That's a quote. And another quote, an agrarian region plagued by war and death. So although all the sources partake in this, there's one that is especially committed to painting a Balkanist picture of this. He calls it Grim Place, after he reassures his readership that they're not alone in not knowing anything about this land of the eagles, as he calls them. So I'm gonna quote like a specific, oh no, okay, never mind. I'm gonna quote a specific paragraph that's I think pertinent to what we're talking about here today. Quote, in response to the first gay pride, wait, let me see. So this is talking about a conversation that he's having with his driver and translator. One second. Sorry. So in response to the first gay pride parade, sorry, I saw a question. Which article? The one that I'm quoting from now is from 2014. In response to the first gay pride parade held in Tirana this past spring, the Deputy Minister of Defense was quoted as saying of the celebrants, quote, what remains to be done is to beat them up with a stick. If you don't understand this, I can explain it. To beat them with a rubber stick, end quote, within the quote. This, of course, is the sort of machismo that can be sulfurous, and Albania is one of the most macho places I've been, rubber sticks aside. People are quick to glare rather than smile, and in part because of this centuries-old defensive crouch, this constant game of hair-triggered chicken, the northern part of the country is notorious for a plethora of blood feuds, end quote. And later, the same author says, the quote, now he asked if I believed in gay marriage, but before I could answer, he stated his unequivocal opposition, end quote. So here we see that the authors of this article juxtapose kind of like the wildness and aggression of this country that's notorious for a plethora of blood feuds with oh yeah, and they also describe them as expert in the lazy, if paranoid, killing of daytime hours, sucking nicotine and caffeine. So they contrast this to the ostensible civility of the West as exemplified by West's implied disapproval of the anti-gay sentiments of this Albanian deputy minister. So it becomes obvious that what's at play here is precisely the type of construction of the West via its politics of LGBT rights, as epitomized in the, support for the epitome of queer liberation, gay marriage, whatever, in opposition to the Balkan and others, whose degree of development has not yet reached the stage in the unilinear march towards progress. So this is then like a first-hand example of how these discourses that we talked about like previously, kind of like in the theory section, how they show up in the texts they were analyzing. So hand in hand with all of this backwardness, primitiveness, etc., come these references to things or people seeming as if they're from a different time. So like all of the accounts refer to the Kanun, a medieval canon of laws, which dates back to the 15th century, which has been passed on orally among the clans of northern Albania. And this set of laws dictates that families be patrilinear, patriarchal, meaning that wealth is inherited through men, with the women obligated to move into their husband's household, and thus resulting in property-like treatment of women. So in talking about this, they're talking about, okay, so there's this medieval canon from the 15th century where, you know, women were property. But the authors completely failed to mention that women in Western Europe and the US definitely enjoyed similar treatment at the time and well into the 19th century, with equal property rights for white women not being officially legislated in Western European countries until the early 20th century, while Black women in the US were literally legally considered property until 1865. So another, like one of the sources similarly quotes gender equality statistics, stating that the 10% gender wage gap in Albania in 2014 as proof of the high levels of patriarchal oppression in contemporary Albania, which, you know, don't get me wrong, I'm sure it's there, but they also like fail to compare this statistic to the EU average of 14.1% of gender wage gap in 2020. So the failure to put either of these circumstances into context kind of points to how these authors attempt to use the politics of gender equality as a sign of Albania's trailing behind the West on the civilizational ladder. Let me just see how much more we have. We don't have that much, almost there. So another really striking motif is that of describing tojbeli as dying out. So all the accounts analyzed frame tojbeli as a dying custom or phenomenon, either in the title or in the opening sentences of their article. So there's titles like Meet the Last Born Virgin, Last of the Nanaša, The Quest to Tell Their Story Before It's Gone. And so the tojbeli's slow disappearance is often discursively linked to processes of modernization that Albania has undergone in the recent decades, and is exemplified in statements such as, quote, mercifully, the oppressive conditions that created the Budnesha culture are relaxing, meaning that the tradition is dying out, and there are estimated to be less than 100 sworn virgins left in Albania. And there's no longer any need for a woman to take the vow, end quote. This is also from 2014. And then my favorite quote, but in Albania today, with internet dating and MTV, the custom is all but disappearing. Girls no longer want to become boys, end quote. So, you know, despite the fact that I don't really understand what the connection is between the availability of MTV and people's gender identity, and I don't know where they get the source for girls no longer wanting to become boys, because I know at least one who does, without doing any research. What is evident is the author's stance that there is no space for tojbeli in their contemporaneity. So here I will quote from Jeta Jetim's Luboteni's 2020 study on video representations of tojbeli. And this account is great because this person is from Albania and they talk about how they never heard about Albanian sworn virgins through Albanian sources. They only heard about it through English sources. And even when there's like videos in Albanian by Albanians about it, they quote English, like Western authors on it, to the point that they even translate the name Albanian sworn virgin back into Albanian instead of using like the local terms for them. Crazy. Anyway, so the quote is, the videos seem to suggest that certain orientations and positions are unlivable as Albania increasingly opens to the global economy and its corresponding gender regimes. Following Puar, it is clear that Burnesha are anything but properly queer subjects, primarily because they are submitting to a patriarchal culture. Instead, they should be submitting to Western capitalism in order to truly be free, in brackets, i.e. homonationalism. Therefore, they have been targeted for death, not by bombing, but by a slow dying out. The images of wrinkled, ill, old women who became men in popular media confirm this and make death seem inevitable. End quote. So this resonates in many of the articles. They refer to like there's only 40 sworn virgins left. They're all over 50. You know, all of this stuff. Last paragraph. Tojbeli in this day and age are presented as so rare that they take on an almost mythical air in many of the accounts. So here again, the same author that before was describing the gay marriage and the stuff as the proof of Albania being backwards, is the most obvious perpetrator. And the authors state that, quote, as time has marched on and the Burneshas have begun dying off, they really have become more rumor than reality. The flickering phantom right around the corner, up this path, in this house over here, vanishing before our eyes, taking their stories to the grave. Like, okay. So here, the Western author is placed in the position of the savior researcher who is trying to salvage what is left of this practice in their writing before it's too late. But more strikingly and upsettingly, in the same breath, assign Tojbeli to the position of the non-human phantom, more rumor than reality. At a different point, the authors similarly attempt to illuminate the rarity of Tojbeli by likening them no less than to unicorns and elves. At a later moment still, the same author finds themselves wondering in an act of, you know, colonial and transphobic erasure and with the obligatory misgendering, whether the Tojbeli to whom they had just been speaking exist at all. So, quote, in that fleeting moment, her fatigues created the optical illusions of a body fading into the trees, and it was unclear who she might be anymore, or if she was there at all. End quote. Okay. I mean, there's so much more. There's so much more, like referring to them as the lost tribe, as the fast dwindling tribe, like all of this stuff. But I'm gonna stop here because, you know, time. Okay. Yeah, so bringing it back to Slovenia and what we're doing in our activism here and how we're talking about it or not, or, you know, with the people that I've spoken to, a lot of people who I would have expected that would have heard about Tojbeli had not. I heard through some interviews that there was an exhibition, I think organized by Kvartir, about it, and there was a play, like a theater performance in 2018-19, and a lot of people heard it. Not Kvartir, okay, someone else. So a lot of people like heard of it through those channels. And also what I've kind of like looked into is whether there's anti-racism work being done by trans or queer activists in the region, to which the answer was no. So while some people mentioned that certain organizations have organized events or panels about intersectionality or racism, the people that I spoke to also explained that those largely focused on international contexts, not on the Slovenian context, with the exception of occasional panels featuring Roma activists, but nothing major. And the people that I spoke to were critical of this. So yeah, like maybe this is a good moment to kind of, well, maybe take a breather for like 3 seconds, and then kind of like open up and see like the people who are here, who are engaged with queer activism, trans activism, what their like prior knowledge of the topic is, how they see this kind of, what I see as an absence of talking about it within this context, and you know, what could be gained from bringing this into our conversations. Thank you so much for listening to me. I'm going to take a lot of Tedevita now.
Yeah, so to keep with the Balkan traditions, at least. At least those we can abide to, all of us, I think. So yeah, thank you, Asja, for this very fascinating overview. I think that now it's a good time to take audience questions. I will be the first to admit that I myself did not know anything about this topic, but I'm very okay with always admitting when I don't know anything. I like it that way. So let's see if there's first maybe some comments or some answers that have not been answered from the chats. No, there's just compliments about puppies, of course. Let me check also on our Facebook page, just in case. But is anyone from the audience here in Zoom that would like to ask some questions or have? Yeah, I can see Urška.
Okay, I have a question like regarding pronouns in Balkan languages, in Slavic languages, because I think like it's definitely problematic, but it's also like a hard thing in language. Like myself, when I write, I usually just interchange like feminine and masculine, but like what are your solutions perhaps like in Croatian language, and like how do you how do you solve the pronouns thing in writing?
Thanks for asking this. I also sometimes interchange. Other times I use the underscore, so like on underscore a, and then I'm trying to think of an example of like a verb in past tense, like I would be like živio skola, for like I have lived, whatever. I know that people in Croatia also use just kind of like without like with how you would use it in Slovenian with the underscore, but just without the underscore. So just kind of like writing it as like one word. I've seen also with a slash, but I don't think that's used so much. I think maybe maybe someone else has more insight into this, because I haven't actually existed as non-binary within these languages for that long, and I'm still actually getting used to it myself. But I also want to say that this is like an example of an issue that is specifically related to our context that we don't really have functional solutions to, and would require some attention. So, you know, if there's any linguists that you know, maybe try to press them to figure out how we can talk about ourselves.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's so ingrained that it's very difficult to go. Like in the English language, you can really quickly absorb it. And then like from a Slavic language that ingrains like gender so much in every part of the sentence, is very difficult to like avoid it. Then you just, you know, like in the end, you know, even like, you know, it's very difficult. So I think, yeah, I think there has been some attempts, but you know, there's always this little clusters that form and then attempt to solve the problem, but we need to solve it, you know, together, because if the words are not, the proper words are not used, then they don't become canon. And it's very difficult to, you know, I would, you know, to then appropriate them and use them in everyday language, how, you know, how they should be.
Yeah, I think I have like some problems with the underscore, like especially writing reviews or writing like longer text for like magazines. I find it a little bit like, I don't know, unpleasant is not the right word, but yeah, maybe problematic. I prefer to interchange it, but always looking for new solutions. We need more linguists. I just talked to trans people about it, but maybe more language.
Maybe just to catch up on what has been written down in the comments. Edi and Karin have mentioned that, you know, the topic is really important within the trans/queer community, but that we really don't talk about it that much. And Lynn shared that Lesbična četvrt, the festival, hosted a play called Sine. It was a production of City of Women. I believe Natasha Živković plays in that.
Yep.
And after that, there was a discussion on this topic. So this was in 2019.
Yeah, thank you for that. I thought it was 2018, but yeah.
Well, I mean, if there aren't any specific questions at this moment, I have one, not just for you, Asja, like for everyone present here, like more something to reflect upon. Because, I mean, it's basically a continuation of the question you posed at the end, like, why do we not engage in this topic more in this in our space? And I'm wondering, like, the whole process of hierarchies of the East, did we perhaps, like, do we have a problem with trying to connect too much to the Western narratives and try to dissociate ourselves, like in a Slovenian context or in a Croatian context or whatever Western Balkan context, that, you know, to prove that we are well developed within this narrative of linear development, that we, like, do we have do we feel an association with the local traditions, such as the traditions of tojbeli? Are we close enough to it, or are we, I'm trying to figure out how to frame this, but like, maybe what are the obstacles that perhaps prevent us from, you know, connecting to these local traditions? Do we see them as others, or do we, like, even consider them as local to us. Does my question make sense? I mean, would anybody like try to, I don't know, maybe engage with this, because I'm not even sure what I'm asking. It's just, I'm trying to place ourselves within this, because I personally don't feel that comfortable with, just appropriating all the Western narratives for our own activism, but also like where to position ourselves to cultures that we have othered historically. Like, yeah, sorry, I'll stop talking. Maybe if anyone would like to engage with that. And crickets.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely feel we're leaning.
Yes, somebody's saying great point, Eva. So Lynn and Leah
Thank you.
are one-upping you, like, yay, go. I guess. And this is, well, I think that this is also a problem of the whole discourse. If the whole discourse of let's say Balkanism is negative, then of course that, like our minds would be adapted to, go away from that and to try to associate with the conversation of like this positive West and like the progressive West and whatever, even if it's a fantasy. It's, this mythologies that they're trying to portray, they are also, they're how the West speaks about it themselves. It's also a mythology. It's not, it's as a fairy tale as anything else, So, maybe, to try to engage in this discourse more honestly and to really realize that there are, wrongs have been done, throughout the place, and, nobody's except from it would be like a first stepping stone to, to breach those, like, and to try to take everything less black and white, because throughout I said throughout those texts everything felt, very either one or the other. Like it's never like some trying to look impartially on the it's always like this is it, kind of. What do you think, Asja, maybe on this subject?
I saw that Eddie and Karin unmuted themselves. Put myself back up.
I need to put myself in gallery view so I can see everyone. Hi, everyone.
Hi. Yeah, like what Eva said really made me think. I mean, it does make a lot of sense, because like when I was raised, I was told that Yugoslavia fell apart because Slovenia did most of the like held the economy of Yugoslavia, and we wanted to keep it like for ourselves. That was the story I was told, for example. It's so layered that this is just but and also like just the attitude that we have towards people that come to live here and work from the Balkan region. I mean, so for example, I was raised in a way to look down at them, and to aim for the north or for the UK or whatever. Kind of that was kind of the goal, like the American dream, just that it's not American, it's European in this sense. And that for me explains kind of why we all lean towards the appropriation of the West, like taking concepts out of there and kind of imprinting it into ourselves, because that's what we see as better. And I also realized how little I actually know about the Balkans, about the history. Like kind of ashamed of it, you know, but it's because we don't learn about it that much, not into detail, not about how it affects like where we are now as a country, as call it a nation or whatever, you know. So yeah, for me it makes a lot of sense that this is what we do, but it's also a big question and a big conversation that is very important for our community, because I can relate in so many ways, much more with anyone from the Balkan region than I can with someone from Austria, you know, in so many ways. But that's me, you know, and this is also me reflecting on these beliefs I had about the Balkan, and everything. So it's kind of changing. I feel like I'm going back to the roots in a sense, with knowing more about the history in our region.
Thanks for sharing this. Yeah, like I think for me, there's been like a similar movement in thought, in terms of like, at some point when I was doing whatever studies, you know, I was researching kind of reproductive labor laws in the US or whatever, and I realized at some point that I know so much more about the feminist history of the US than I knew nothing about Croatia, nothing about Yugoslavia. And then the same thing happened when this Albanian sworn virgin thing, when I found out about this, I was like, I knew about, you know, non-binary genders in India, in Northern America, in this place, in that place, but I didn't know about it in like Albania, and not just Albania, like there used to be some, maybe there are still some in like Dalmatia, you know, like in the hinterland somewhere. And I was just mind blown. How is this? What is this? And I just realized that so much of this discourse, this Eurocentric superiority, etc. thing, was just like embedded in my brain. And I didn't want to look at Croatia and Yugoslavia and whatever. I didn't care. Because I didn't think much of it. And yeah, I think, I don't know. I think there is this distancing. Oh, there's a long comment. I think there is this distancing, and I would like to talk about what it would take for us to stop doing this. And now I'm going to read the comment.
While you're reading, I just maybe like to say something. You know, when Yugoslavia was still on, we had a lot of, you know, learning about it and all about the republics of Yugoslavia in school. But after the samosvojitev and independence of Slovenia, that stopped. And I think also we have to look about this problem from different point of view. It's not just that we who are talking here are inclined to search for the answers somewhere more north, but it's also that these things do not get much public attention, and that's the problem as well. It's not just us, it's everything, you know. It's like a systematic denial of things that exist. So I think that's also important to mention.
I was thinking about that. It's like a hierarchy of information, and you only access the top of the top, which, you know, everything else is just buried under, and like you have to make a conscious and great effort to, you know, access information that is not perhaps I want to say widely available, but that's not what I meant. Like it's marginalized systemically, as you said.
Yeah, and I agree with what you said, Anna, and I just wanted to add, you know, but it's not there, it's not out there. There is a lack of information. But I feel like if it's not us who are going to push for this to for these conversations to happen, for this information to be brought into, you know, the public sphere, it's not gonna, if it's not the feminists and the activists and the, you know, who it's not gonna happen.
Yeah, well, I agree with that, of course, but you know, it's just important also to know that this is not entirely our fault, you know. I think that's important to say.
Yeah, fair enough, fair enough.
Yeah, maybe I would like to add a word here, considering why we don't know much about our local history, cultural history, and so on, regarding the generations that were born after Yugoslavia fell apart. I think that what happened to me, I come from mixed marriage. My mother is a Slovene, my father is a Serb, and I was studying South Slavic languages. And what was most shocking to me was that I discovered that basically when we started going into primary school, all of the writers, all of the literature, all of the history almost from Yugoslavia was basically erased. I don't know if this is the same thing that happened in Croatia, but when I was studying and I met some friends from Serbia, and they were like, yeah, we know about Japancic, Mihurčke, and we know about Prešeren. And I was like, wait, how come you know about our writers, about our poets? And they said, we've been learning them in school, and they were my generation. I'm 85. And I was like, but how come we haven't learned about anyone? And then I started doing a little survey among my friends and asking them, do you know who Ivo Andrić was? And I was shocked to hear the answers. No, who are you talking about? And these were educated people, in colleges. And then, I started slowly to discover that, we were basically deprived from a lot of culture, literature, history of ex-Yugoslavia. And I think there are important studies to come regarding this, and important studies of comparing textbooks in primary schools, how much nationalism and how much it was not shown to us when we were, especially in Slovenia from 1991, we were independent. It was nothing. Like Yugoslavia never existed. Like it was, the lover you're kind of ashamed of, and you don't want to talk about her or him. So I think maybe our generation is that we have to start speaking about it and get to know our roots, like somebody already said in this conversation. So I'm really happy that we're having this discussion about it right now, and not just about, of course, also about LGBTIQ plus and other communities in our neighborhood, of course.
Yeah, it's true. As I was saying, I was born in 76, and I went to school when there was still Yugoslavia, and it's true the curriculums have changed drastically. It's just like an erasure of Yugoslavia, and all the important things that were part of it. And it's just like it's brisani in some point. It's very much similar, just like you said, actually.
But also, I mean, the Albanians within Yugoslavia were always erased. I don't think there was ever we had the Slavic nations, and from what I know, this was the other even within Yugoslavia. So
I agree.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, like there's a long history of discrimination against Albanian populations in all the countries, I think, to the point that there's derogatory terms that are used for them that people don't even consider derogatory. They just consider them to be the name of the peoples. But yeah.
I'm going to be brutally honest. To me, as I was young, they were introduced as the ones that make ice cream. You know, that was kind of like their specialty. Those that come to Slovenia to make ice cream. And yes, there's a very specific word. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And then later on, it was those that sell vegetables and fruits.
Yeah, like there's specific stereotypes for like each of the different, you know, ethnicities within Yugoslavia, right? And yeah, this was the stereotype for people from Albania. I wanted to say something to what Anna said, but I forgot. Shit. Never mind.
So do we have any more questions from the audience? Or maybe Asja has some questions for us.
I mean, I would love to talk about this more with anyone who would want to talk to me about it. So if you're at all interested in continuing this at any point over Zoom or, you know, in real life when we can do that, please message me. Let's I don't know, bring this topic a bit more to the fore than it is now.
Asja, how do you personally perceive tojbeli? I mean, I heard of them years ago, but when you were asking how, what was your first time you heard about virdžine or tojbeli, for me it was, I think, I'm not sure, but as I remember, it was in a women's magazine, you know, the ones you go, and it was very superficially, you know, yeah, men, women becoming men and blah, 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 blah. And yeah, I didn't know much about it except this. And then later on, I read some other articles, supposedly the ones you were talking about before, the problematic ones. But yeah, I'm really interested to know, how do you personally, as a non-binary person from Croatia, well, how do you see them? What they mean to you?
Thanks for asking this. Yeah, like when I first came across them, I was already, you know, familiar with like trans things. So I didn't buy the whole women who become men thing. I was lucky to not have seen it when I was too young. But for me, it was really, so like I read them as trans individuals. I don't want to use that term because that's a, you know, that's not a term that they use for themselves. That is, and you know, would be an imposition of my vocabulary onto their existence. But this is like when I first read about them without like thinking about it at all, I was like, there's trans people in Albania who have been here for hundreds of years. And like, for me, it was really magical. It was really, you know, especially with this whole shit that non-binary people get about transgenders, and this is, you know, it's cool and trendy now, and it's this like thing that kids in the US are doing, so people here are starting to do it too. I'm like, no, people have been doing it here for 500 years. Fuck off. So it was really, really affirming to me to read about them. But now the, you know, the thing that I would like to, there's also like, there's also something to be said about, you know, a white, blue-eyed, middle-class person from northern Croatia being inspired by the existence of these people who like live in really bad conditions, in poverty and rural, often in poverty and rural Albania, and etc. And like, it can't stop there. It can't stop with us being inspired, right? I think we can learn a lot about ourselves and our history and etc. Through looking at them. But I think we also then need to think about, okay, but what can we do for them? Like, what do they need? How can we, you know what I mean? So this is kind of where I would like the conversation to go. In terms of how, you know, I don't know if they want to be, I haven't spoken to them. I don't know if they want to, how they want to be referred to themselves, how, whether they In the part of the thesis that I didn't talk about because of time, I talked about, like, you know, would they even want to be associated with the trans people in you know, Slovenia? Do they even, you know what I mean? Like, we can't assume these things. So yeah, just like a lot more research, a lot more talking, a lot more thinking about how we can help, how we can connect things. Sorry, I realized that this was not necessarily the answer to your question. I went a bit broader, but.
No, it's great. Thank you. Thank you a lot. Maybe just one thing that also fascinated me. I think if you would do a field research in going through the villages or towns, that you would find a lot of trans people in history. What shocked me, my mom comes from a village from Prekmurje. It's the less developed region from Slovenia. It's even in Prekmurje, it's the less developed part, Goričko. And she was telling me from I was a little girl that there was this guy called Vonchi, and he was dressing as a woman all of his life, and they perceived him as a woman, and he was young in 50s. So I think if we would start searching through history, we will see that this is not something that, you know, yeah, we try to, I don't know, imitate from the West, but this is something that existed in Slovenia, in Croatia, in Serbia through all of our history. So yeah, maybe a little more field research, and we would find out amazing stories and amazing things. And yeah, I'm sure tojbeli are not the only ones out there in our neighborhood.
So I will point out that there's another question that we have from a Facebook comment. So I will try to quickly read it through. So dear all, thank you so much for this interesting discussion. I wonder what can be the strategies to reappropriate the history of Yugoslavia by today's queer communities in Slovenia. I mean, how to queer the history and to subvert the dominant discourses in Slovenia. I'm asking as I am from Belarus, but I live in Slovenia.
Yeah, that's the question.
Sure, now we need answers.
I don't have any. Just pointing that out.
Sure, I think that, you know, Tina's suggestion to do more and more research on this topic would be basis number one. As we could really see from your lecture, I think that a lot of things have been built up as stories, as, you know, some kind of fictional characters, even for the entertainment of others, while it's not really based on any facts. So, and I really do hope that all the texts that you have reviewed are not ethnographical texts, because if not, this is really bad ethnography work. So maybe this is my question, like, are some of them, you know, ethnographic, or at least claiming to be, you know, research papers or something?
No, this is popular journalism, but I have looked at some articles, and I wouldn't be able to quote them or think of the specific ones now because this was some time back, but that did claim to some scientificality and that reproduced similar things, not in such, you know, stark, explicit, you know, not calling them unicorns, but in more subtler ways, reproducing the same stuff.
You maybe just to, oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Go.
It's me again. So Sasha's comment from Facebook got me thinking, and I think I think like for me personally, how I do it, I try to talk to people. Talk to people from the Balkans, try to meet them, ask them for like their stories, their history, what they know about it. I try to educate myself because I think that these strategies have to become always come from one place, and then we can talk about it more. Conversations and can happen more often, more quickly within bigger and bigger circles. But I think like such events and similar are kind of what we start with, I guess. Because to make a big change, you have to make the small steps first. And I think the first thing we have to do is just to be curious, like just to ask questions, you know. Why don't I know this? How could I know more about this? And just try to get as close to the source as possible. And then, you know, do that. I think that's how it kind of starts. Yeah.
I think also connecting more and like talking, starting these conversations within maybe Transmreža Balkan and like the Transpodium crowd would be a good way of like opening it up, because that's an example of a good practice of actual like pan-Yugoslavian alliance of queer activism. So this is for us to push in the coming months.
There's also a comment here in this chat, and I think it relates to just the whole idea of, you know, making sure that we put forward the stories. So Kat pointed out, you know, we have like feminist and queer tours of Ljubljana, where you visit places and tell the stories of people who live there. And they point out that this is an interesting strategy in terms of changing how the city and history is narrated. So I think that connects to also just the whole idea that we search for stories, we have to be vigilant in, you know, telling them, in sharing them, and yeah, making sure that I guess marginalized narratives are brought up to the front.
Yeah, actually, I'm one of the guides for feminist tour in Ljubljana, so I welcome you to join us when the tours will be able to to be held in Ljubljana. Now we have only private ones, but I think we'll have public ones soon, I hope. But there is also queer tour. It's not from the same institution, but I know it exists. LGBT. I think Susanna Tratnik is the guide there also. So yeah, they're both great, and yeah, I invite you all to join them sometimes.
So I'm really sorry. I would like not to really cut off this lovely start of a conversation. It's not the end, it's the start. I just want to address that we're a bit over time on our time, but I will just address quickly our audience that is with us through Facebook and the live stream, and then cut the live stream off and leave this Zoom open for everyone. Is just so, you know, we cut it somewhere and then we can get even more comfortable with the questions that we have, with the answers that we want to give, etc., etc. So to everyone listening to us or watching us through Facebook Live, thank you for being with us. Thank you, Asja, for being with us and like introducing us to like some really, really, you know, we're even getting hearts here, to some, a really, really good and well-structured lecture. And yes, I can even see that even with all the structure, it's just barely like scraping the surface. And I think that a lot of us are feeling, you know, quite you know, like ecstatic about the you know, discovering more. I would invite everyone that's here, and of course everyone online, to follow up on Rdeče Zore's Red Dawn's events for the next few days. We're still on until the 11th of March. And we will be streaming everything through our Facebook page. So please join us. You can find more about the program through www.rdečezore.org. Thank you.